So what I'm going to do here is show, I'm nowhere near as far into Claris Studio as some other people, but what I wanted to show is a version of something we're going to be doing, or actually are already doing in-house, where we decided to use Claris Studio to create a new client questionnaire. So we've had this scenario where we are starting to work with a new client, and we have sort of a number of questions that we want to have answered. And in the past, we've sort of haphazardly come across the answers to those questions. Like how do they prefer to receive an invoice? Do they want to do a weekly status meeting? Do they think that's not necessary? Those kinds of things. And so we decided to aggregate that into a new client questionnaire and use Claris Studio to gather that as an anonymous web form. But our CRM app, we use a bunch of different stuff, but one of our tools for aggregating data from our different systems, Teamwork and other systems, is a FileMaker app that we wrote. And we're not ready to migrate that to FileMaker or to Claris Studio quite yet. And so our desire was to get our new client questionnaire data into our FileMaker app. And so what I'm going to kind of show is creating a quick form in Claris Studio, showing that data in Claris Pro, and showing using Claris Connect to push that data into our FileMaker server based app. I'm going to start out in Claris Studio after I share my screen, using my small MacBook Air screen instead of my big desktop screen so people can see it a little bit better. If you haven't worked with Claris, the new Claris platform, Claris Studio, this is the user interface. I'm going to start here in views and create a new view. I'm not going to do anything very complicated at all, since the purpose of this is more about sharing data between the systems than actually how to use Claris Studio. So I'm just taking the default new form template that Claris Studio gives you, which is for an imaginary registration process. And I'm going to change that to I'm going to make up an example, and I'm going to say this is a recipe, maybe a recipe submission database. So I'm going to create a custom web form for somebody to come to and submit a recipe. So I just changed the title to recipe, changed the comment section to recipe. And just for the fun of it, I'm going to change my field name here. Instead of being called comments, I'm going to change it to recipe. And I'm going to make my comments field required. And now I'm going to go out of here, go back to my views section, and going to look at my spreadsheet version of that. I don't need to do anything here right at the moment, except for one kind of tricky thing that it is a little bit obscure, this ability in Claris Studio to rename the table. As far as I know, this is the only place you can do it, and it can be a little bit confusing when you're moving data between systems and you've got your table name not correct. The whole concept of a table in Claris Studio is a little confusing if you're used to FileMaker Pro and traditional relational schema. There really isn't a relational schema in Claris Studio. There's just a bunch of fields, and I think it'll be an interesting area. I think as we see Claris Studio evolving, how that's the way of organizing that schema evolves will be interesting. So I've created two layouts. I'm going to rename this one recipe entry. And I'm going to go into hubs just for the fun of it. I'm going to create a new hub and organize those two recipes into a hub. Hubs are another way of another thing you could call a hub would be a project. Hubs are sort of like projects. So now I've got my form in here, and I can start letting people do data entry through it. All I have to do is start sharing it. Let's see here. So let's see here. So I can start entering. I can start entering information here and submitting that information. So I'm in preview mode, so nothing actually got submitted there. So I can now go in and share the form so that other people can enter data through it. As I said, I'm fairly new at this myself, and I've now lost track of where my share icon went to.
I think it's up there, yeah.
There it is, thank you. So now I can actually go to a web browser, which I'm already in conveniently, and go to that form and start entering recipes. So I'm going to put one in as Fred Flintstone, Fred at bedrock.com. I'm probably dating myself a little bit here. And I click submit. And not exactly what this presentation is about, but you can see how easy it is to throw together an anonymous web gathering tool with Claris Studio there. One really important thing that took me a little while to track down as I was working on this is the authentication. So I want to be able to access that Claris Studio data now from Claris Pro and Claris Connect, particularly Claris Connect. And I don't know if it's well documented, and I didn't find it quickly or what, but it took me a little while to find this issue here, where under my account in Claris Studio, there's this extended account menu item here. It's not completely intuitive that what's required here is I have a Claris Studio ID. My email address, john@portagebay.com, is my Claris Studio ID. But in order to connect to my Claris Studio data from Claris Connect, I have to grant that Claris ID extended account privileges, which you do by giving a different password that has more stringent password requirements. So I, in effect, have two different Claris ID passwords now, one for just logging into Claris Studio to do dev work, and a different one that I have to use to authenticate to the API from within Claris Connect to be able to get my Claris Connect flow to work. So I've done that already. I've granted my Claris ID that privilege to do the API connection. I'm going to switch over to Claris Pro just for a moment. I've got my royal blue Claris Pro and my slate blue FileMaker Pro. And in Claris Pro, I have a layout created here that is my shadow table into Claris Studio. I'm going to show this in the relationship graph. And I'm going to, from this point forward, I'm going to talk about a different set of forms I created in Claris Studio called landscape quotes. I started out with recipes so I could show a brand new form being created, but for the rest of this, I'm going to use a different set of a different view I previously created called landscape quotes, because I've already created that stuff in Claris Pro and Claris and FileMaker Server and in Claris Connect. So I've added this shadow table. If anybody's familiar with FileMaker's ESS capabilities, this is quite similar to that. The table occurrence here is in quotes, indicating that it's not a table that exists actually in FileMaker in Claris Server, Claris Pro. It's a shadow table representing the data that's actually living in Claris Studio. Yep,
You said in quotes, you really meant to say in italics.
I did. Thank you. Italics. So I can add a new table here. I'm going to click the table occurrence button here for adding, and I'm going to select Claris Studio as the data source. This is really easy. I didn't have to do anything. Claris Pro knows that it's part of Claris Platform, so it's easy to select Claris Studio there. And I can click my recipe data here, and now I've got the italicized recipe table occurrence there. So that's pretty easy, and I can now go in and create layouts for that. Like I said, I'm going to use the landscape quotes example from now on. So if I leave my relationship graph and go back out to Claris Pro here, I've got 4 records in my landscape quotes table here. Let's see, what was I going to say here? One thing to be aware of here, and I don't know if anybody has run into this and has an answer for it, but one thing, I don't know if this is a bug or something I haven't figured out how to do yet, but in looking at the data in Claris Server, it doesn't appear to me that that renaming of fields in Claris Studio transfers over to Claris Pro. I can go into the relationship graph and sync the schema, but this field name, which I've called migrated in Claris Studio. So if I go over here to Claris Studio and look at my landscape quotes example, and I look at this, I don't have that field visible on my form. It's a hidden field. But if I go in here and look at my fields, I've renamed that field migrated in Claris Studio, but when you see it in Claris Pro, it shows up as a generic field number 5. I haven't had a chance to look into whether that's just a feature that hasn't been implemented yet, or if I'm doing something wrong. But it's so far it seems to me I've told it to sync the schema and the name didn't change. So I think that might be a bug. Let's see. So I've got my data. I'm looking at my data now in Claris Pro, which is interesting, but it's not my final goal, which was to try and get the data into FileMaker Server, FileMaker Pro. So I'm going to go back over into Claris Studio and grab my URL for this form, my landscape quotes form, and I'm going to create one real quick. So I'm going to enter a new one. This one's going to be Barney Rubble. I guess he can be at bedrock, sand, and gravel also. I want some trees planted. And in this one, I customized the confirmation page just a little bit. Going back over to Claris Pro, I now should be seeing that same data. Something not working quite right here. I did this test 2 one like half an hour ago, so I know it was working. I had a problem, and I haven't talked. Maybe I should pause for a second and talk about the backend side a little bit. This is obviously Claris Server is, if it's, I say obvious, but it may or may not be obvious. I'm logged into this PBS template file on Claris Server. And that's an on-premise version of Claris Server running on a virtual machine that I spun up and installed Ubuntu on. Claris Platform Cloud isn't out yet, so if you're doing something like this, you do have to have Claris Server. And something happened. I think it's because I'm inherently cheap, and I have it running on an AWS T2 small instance, which I think, based on the goofing around I've been doing, it might be a little weak for Ubuntu version 20 and Claris server. And I think something happened there, and the virtual machine had a problem, and I ended up having to reinstall Claris server. And that might be what's going on here. I might have lost my link to the Claris Studio table in the process somehow. So for purposes of keeping things moving forward, let's take it for granted, or take it on faith, that this really does work pretty seamlessly, that the form created in Claris server, in Claris Studio, that will show up pretty easily here in Claris Pro. And for the moment anyway, I'm just going to create another test record here. Does anybody have any questions about Claris server, Ubuntu, any of that stuff? That seems to me, from my perspective, one of the significant changes here in the environment, based on compared to previous times.
Hey, John, it's Brad. What kind of effort level is in setup for all of that stuff to begin with, if you're going from zero?
Well, zero.
Relative zero.
Yeah.
We all have some sort of experience.
Yeah. So I'll say what I know. I would consider myself, more or less expert or advanced on FileMaker server configuration, installation and configuration on Windows, and pretty much the same on Mac. I've been doing both for 20, 30 years, whatever. And I am not an expert on Ubuntu at all. That said, the white paper that Brandon put into the Slack channel, that FileMaker produced, and the blog post that Wim Decor did on the Ubuntu Claris server installation, those resources allowed me to, I already know how to spin up a Ubuntu virtual machine in AWS, Amazon Web Services. That part's just about the same as it is for Windows. You just select what virtual machine image you want to start with, and so I chose Ubuntu 20. That part's pretty easy. And then I used, at the time, Claris's white paper wasn't out quite yet, and so I was using Wim Decor's blog post. But either one of them walks you through pretty well what you have to do to get Ubuntu installed, and to get Claris server installed on that. The biggest problem for me there is just that I'm not an Ubuntu expert. So things that are, things that, for somebody who knows Ubuntu, things that are second nature, probably take them 5 minutes, take me a half hour of searching online trying to find an answer. An example of that is I was getting this weird color profiles error in Ubuntu. I would restart the virtual machine, and I'd get this color profile error. And in order to click on a particular button I needed to click on, I had to get rid of the color profile error, and it wouldn't go away. And it took me a half hour of searching online, finding what the appropriate solution was, going to the terminal and doing the command line fix to correct that color profile error so that I could continue along with the installation. So not as easy for me as a Windows install, but it wasn't hideous. I got it installed and working. So I don't know if that answered that question fully, but
good enough. It gives us an idea of what it takes.
Yeah. I think it would be nice if somebody wants to start a Claris server Ubuntu users group. That might be nice. I know Claris just announced a working group thing. I signed up for it related to that, so maybe that'll be a good resource for that. Anyway, getting back to this. So now I've got my data in Claris server and Claris Pro. That's easy. And so the little bit of heavy lifting was creating the Claris Connect connection to FileMaker server. So I already have a database running in FileMaker server that I wanted to push this data into. And so I'm going to switch over to FileMaker Pro. So this is a similar table in FileMaker Pro. I've got similar data over here because I've been testing the same connection. But I don't have that last record I put in for Barney Rubble as yet. So I'm going to switch to Claris Connect now and show what I did. There's a couple different ways that you could do what we're looking at here. And I'm going to say that what I did is the somewhat more, I think, I'm not positive about this because, but there's going to be a connector for Claris Studio for Claris Connect eventually. And so that your approach for how you would do this once that connector is available might be different. I did this using Claris Pro as kind of a leapfrog. So I have my Claris Studio data going into Claris Pro in that shadow table. And then I have Claris Connect acting as the bridge connecting to Claris Pro to grab the data, so Claris Server, Claris Pro to grab the data and push it into FileMaker Server. So my connector is, my flow is this Claris Server flow right here. It's a pretty simple flow. The first step just has it running every day at 2 a.m. For example purposes. I just have this running every day at 2 a.m. If this was a real world situation, I'd probably want my data to come over into FileMaker more frequently than that, but I just stuck that there as a trigger to get the rest of this stuff working. So my first flow step is this find records flow step. What I have it doing is connecting to Claris Server, the landscape quotes layout, and searching the field that I had renamed migrated. I have it searching for all the records that are not 1. So I'm using the number 1 as my indicator that the record has already been migrated. And that would say migrated if I knew exactly why it didn't. I knew what was causing that field naming issue. So this flow step simply finds all the records in Claris Server in that table that haven't been migrated yet. And then I'm using the repeat action to loop through all of the records that are found in this find record script step and to create a record in FileMaker Server from each of the records in Claris Server. So I have 2 different server configs being accessed in this flow, the Claris Server one for the find and the FileMaker Server one for creating the records. And then the final step is once for each record that's found in Claris Studio, it's setting that migrated field to the number 1. So the next time it loops through and does another find, it only finds the ones that haven't been migrated yet. So if the stars all align and I click run now, I should get the flow running. It should find that one Barney Rubble record and pull it from Claris Studio into FileMaker Server. So if I go over to my FileMaker Server database, I've now got 8 records in here, which is more than I expected. So there's my Barney Rubble record. And so I guess some other people have joined me in entering some testing. Anyway, that's how we are doing that, getting that data from Claris Studio into FileMaker Server through Claris Connect. Any questions? Anybody have any comments, suggestions, ways they might have done it? All right.
You've got a question. You got a question in the chat.
Oh,
Use
okay.
a webhook.
Yes, could have used a webhook. Kate is our webhooks expert. I'm not. It would have taken me longer to do it with a webhook. But that's a good idea. I think once you gain a little bit more experience than I have with Claris Connect, webhooks are a super go-to tool for sure. That's a good question. That was surprisingly easy. I did not have to define. I thought my go-to, my very first thought was, well, I'm going to have to define an external data source for Claris Studio, but I didn't have to do that. Because Claris Pro is part of Claris Platform and it's all one integrated set of tools. It's already all there. All I had to do was add the table occurrence to my graph, the Claris Studio data source, you can see it's maybe, I mean, it may not be obvious, but it's predefined. All I had to do is select it and then pick my Claris Studio data that I wanted to work with, whether it's my landscape quotes or my recipes. All this other stuff is junk we've been doing in testing and playing around with it. But this is if you were here back in December, this was the ugly layouts upload form that Kate created in Studio. But yeah, that part was really simple. You do have to remember let's see here. You do have to remember to, there's all the standard stuff you have to make sure is working to make, and this isn't unique to Claris Studio at all, but in the FileMaker world and in the networking and IT world, generally speaking, in order for all this to work, you've got to have your firewall configured properly. If my Ubuntu server didn't have, if it was blocking port 80, port 443, then my Claris Connect connection to Claris server wouldn't work. I have to have my permissions set properly. So in Claris server, I have my full access privilege set. I had to go in and enable the FM REST privilege set. Otherwise, Claris Connect wouldn't be able to connect to Claris server. So those kind of standard things they all have to be in place correctly. The big one that hit me, like I already said, was that extended account function in Claris Studio. I had the firewall correct. I had looked up how to double check what your firewall settings are in Linux, in Ubuntu Linux, and verified that. I had verified that my REST API privilege set was correct, but I still was getting authentication failures, and I just couldn't figure out why. And I finally found that extended account function inside Claris Studio where you have to define that password to let your account work with your Claris Studio data through the data API.
John, there's a question in Slack, or maybe Ronnie, about the migrated word. It said, is it possible that migrated is a protected word in Claris Studio?
That is, I would say, I don't know. I could certainly go and just for the fun of it, I could show somebody saying something. I could go over here and change it to something else. Let's say change that, edit that field name and change it to migrated or real. So now I've changed that in Claris Studio. I can go over to Claris Server now and go into the relationship graph, and I can go into, shoot, I've forgotten where the sync button is. There it is. So this is the button that tells Claris Server, Claris Pro, Claris Server to resync the schema of the shadow table to the, in this case, to Claris Studio. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And I would hope that it would change it to whatever my new field name is there, but it doesn't appear to.
Two questions, John. If you created a new table occurrence, would it have the correct schema? Third or second question would be, if you did change it, wouldn't it break all of your,
well, I think that's
all of your processes?
Yes, I think I was stupid, this morning as I was going through all this and making sure I had myself all set for this session today. I realized that the database wasn't accessible, and I got onto the Ubuntu server and saw that the Claris server wasn't running, and was troubleshooting that and reinstalled Claris server, got that working, and I got my connection to Claris server going, and then something distracted me, and I didn't go through and test everything else. And so literally minutes before the meetup started today, I was frantically fixing a couple other things that weren't working. But one thing I didn't do is what you just said. I didn't delete this table occurrence and recreate it and that might be why the data wasn't showing. Although actually, now that I look at it in the background here, my data is showing now. So at some point that Claris Studio data did flow through.
Yeah, we just missed record 178. But
to answer your question, I can try that. I can delete. This is going to
or
break.
just add a new one. Don't delete it, but just add another table occurrence, the same reference. And
Sure.
see if it
I think I tried this and it didn't do it.
didn't
But
update. Yeah,
it happens.
still says yeah.
Still
Number
says
5, and maybe someone else on the call would know.
it's not too big a deal. Thing like
No.
obviously it would become problematic if you were creating a sophisticated set of
Yeah.
forms. I know for our client questionnaire one, it's more of an issue. If we go over to Claris Studio and take a super quick look at that one.
And while you're finding that is another question, can you use your own custom domain for Claris Studio publicly instead of platform.claris.com?
That is an excellent question. I was wondering that myself. I believe I couldn't find an answer in searching for it, and I asked Kate. She thought the answer was no, not yet. But I don't know that we know that absolutely definitively. Let's see here. So if I go in and let's see. So we've got the same issue in this file, although a little bit not quite as not terrible, but things like short text drop down too, and there's a lot more fields here, so it becomes more problematic to not be able to see those renamed fields in Claris Connect or whatever else we're looking at. Anyway. Any other questions? Yeah, platform.claris. Yeah, if you can't use a custom domain, I'm very sure that's something that's going to be on an early, at least I would think would be an early improvement they would make, because obviously anybody wanting to use these custom web forms for an anonymous data gather is going to want their own domain on it. Cool. Well, I appreciate everybody joining me for that. And I will turn it back over to Kate.